Welcome to all the delegates and the panelists. Today we've got Olga and Miraldi from the CUT, and then from SAB we've got Anton. We've also got Troy May, the MC of last year, that's part of the panelists today. And we've got Apiwe from BASA, that's also online. So if there's any questions for them, that you know that you can ask them. This is the last webinar for the Intervarsity Brew 2023, and my name is Adele Kroch, and I'm from Food Focus. It's been an honor to be part of the set of webinars once again, and as Food Focus, we really enjoy being part of the Intervarsity Brew 2023. The presentations that we've had up to date is available on the intervarsitybrew.co.za website. And if you've missed any of the previous webinars, you can go to the intervarsitybrew.co.za website and you can go and watch the videos there. So what we've had is we had Kyle Muscovich, and he spoke about how to brew a better beer. And then we had Chris Roth that spoke about BJCP and how to complete the registration form. And then yesterday we had Miraldi Kotza, and she spoke about the do's and don'ts of beer labeling. I just want to repeat some important information on Miraldi's presentation, and that is that you need to have your deliveries at the CUT University to Miraldi's office before the 13th of October, and the manufacturing manufacturing address, sorry, that needs to be on your label. I'm just going to repeat that again. It must say 27 Poppy Avenue, Sunflower Ridge, South Africa. And remember, you are using a 750 milliliter brown bottle. So just to make sure that you take note of that, that's a reason for me repeating it. Once again, these are all the sponsors, and like I've said, make sure that they get to know you and that you interact with them at the event. You never know what it can mean to your future. And what I would like to do now is just to show you the video again so that you can see what happened last year. Every time I see that video, I just think, wow, such amazing prizes and such an amazing competition to be part of. So I hope that it still keeps you guys excited. Now I would like to introduce you to your presenter and his topic. Today, Jacques will be speaking about yeast, selection and nutrition. Jacques completed his MSc in wine biotechnology, where he focused on yeast population dynamics. This has helped him to deeply understand yeast behavior and its role in fermentation. He currently works as a technical sales manager for Lallemand Brewing in South Africa. With over 4 years of experience in the field, he specializes in helping brewers optimize their fermentations for improved beer production. In addition to his work in the industry, he is actively involved in the Intervarsity competition, as well as various homebrew club competitions. He is excited to share his knowledge and expertise with aspiring brewers like yourselves. And today he also he said that, you know, his passion for beer brewing is something that he will never stop to have. And outside of work, he enjoys programming and online gaming. So Jacques, over to you, and we are really looking forward in hearing what you have to share with the delegates. Thanks, Jacques.
All right. Yes, today I'll be talking about yeast selection and nutrition. I'm going to try and keep it on the surface level for you guys as much as possible and not go too technical into the details, but I suppose that's why I'm always hanging around, so that you guys can ask me the more technical details if you wish. But let's get started. So, my slide is not changing for some reason. Okay, there we go. So, just as an overview, what we are going to be covering is a little bit about yeast selection and obviously a bit of nutrition. For yeast selection, we're going to focus on the standard parameters that you tend to look at when you are even considering to do a fermentation, regardless of whether it's beer or wine or distilling setups. But we'll focus then on some of the finer details specific to beer and cover some examples that actually encompass the previous 2 points. As for nutrition, there's many other topics that we could cover, but the most important that I tend to see as a trend in the industry where knowledge is lacking and the application of such is lacking is the introduction of nitrogen or FAN into your fermentations and the use of trace minerals. So let's take a page out of when I first started at the University of Stellenbosch and I was starting to focus on fermentation. The standard parameters that you've got to check your list off of when you are selecting a yeast in general to do fermentation is, what is the type of sugar it is able to ferment? What is its resultant alcohol tolerance that it was able to survive? The temperatures that it likes to operate in, and also what pH is it expecting in the matrix. Now, in beer, we know that the primary sugars for fermentation are maltose, maltotriose, glucose, otherwise known as dextrose. And then there's a few other little things that are generally unfermentable in certain situations, like dextrin. So we need to make sure that our yeast is able to either ferment any of these sugars or not, depending on the beer style that we are doing, which we'll go into a little bit more detail later. Subsequently, the concentration of sugar is also a very important component to factor in, because some strains are actually sensitive to too much sugar in an environment. And this ties very closely in with its resultant alcohol tolerance. So generally, if it's able to even survive the higher levels of sugar, then it can survive a higher level of alcohol, but this isn't necessarily always the case. There is some subtle differences between certain strains, but in general, in beer, we're looking at between 4-5% for standard lager, a little bit higher in the double IPA region of 7 to 10%. Then we get the Belgian big beers that are going from 10 to 13%, really crossing over into wine territory here. It's very important that you make sure that you want all the other characteristics that a strain can bring, but if it can't even survive the high level of a Belgian quad, then there's no real use in using it. Temperature is also a massive thing to take into consideration. So we have ale strains, for example, that like to ferment between 18 degrees Celsius to about 20, 21. Then we have some freaks of nature that are the Quake strains, and certain Belgian strains that can even go as high up to 35 degrees Celsius. So the important thing here that I want to really hammer on, and the same goes true for lager, it's more of a stylistic result that lager strains tend to ferment nicely between 12 and 16 degrees Celsius for the production of a lager, but that doesn't mean that the strain won't do well at 20, 21 degrees Celsius. It's just not going to be in the same characteristics of the fermentation. It's going to behave completely differently. But the general trend is that the lower fermentation temperature is, the slower a yeast will ferment. And the higher temperature range it is, the faster it will. But there are boundaries between the different strains. So if we take a Quake strain, for example, and put it in at 18 degrees, it's going to be comparably sluggish to a normal ale strain at 16 degrees or 18 degrees. It really wants to be warm. So you have to appreciate where the strain has come out of from its evolutionary history. pH is something that is also very important in fermentation. With regards to yeast, we are looking for whether it can survive this pH range. In beer, it happens to be between 4 and 5.5. In fact, it should start at around 5.2, and as fermentation proceeds, it should end towards 4.5, somewhere around there. But if you have your pH at 2.9 because some spoilage buggers got in there, your yeast is really going to struggle. In fact, it probably won't ferment at those pH levels. If we take wine, for example, wine strains like to survive in, and keyword I'm using is survive, in a pH of 3.4, for example. But if you throw it into a pinotage matrix, which is 10 to 1 of a pH of 4, it goes bonkers. It absolutely loves it, and it ferments within 2 days of 24 Plato. So these are the little ticks that you need to make sure are crossed and marked for when you're selecting your yeast out of your agar, or when you are isolating it out in the world. But luckily we have strains that already meet a lot of these tolerances. So moving on to the next side of the spectrum, we have the finer details that we need to look at. So we're going to be paying attention of what's going on inside your flask, as well as what's going on just outside in the aromatic space. So we've now selected our potential yeasts that can survive the standard parameters of beer, and we would like to see of which type of styles it is applicable for, or if it even is giving us what we want. It can ferment to alcohol, but it doesn't really smell great for beer, for example. And these are kind of the things that we need to pay attention to. We need to pay attention to attenuation, which is just a very fancy term for how much residual sugar you're going to be left over in your beer. So it's relating to mouthfeel and body, those type of things. Flocculation is how well the yeast groups and aggregates together at the end of a fermentation and settles down, making it easy for you to process later on, or even harvest to reuse. Then we have biotransformation, and I specifically put a little plant inside the flask to remind you guys that this is all about what is it doing with the hops. The yeast can work very, very well with certain types of hops to bring out extra aromatics in your beers. It's a very important thing to take into consideration when you are working with IPAs, for example. Phenolics is something more akin to your Belgian and German type beers. So we're looking at your pepperiness in the beers, the clove, spice, those type of things. Sometimes you have a more subtle beer that you want, like a Wit, for example, where you don't want as much ferulic acid. But if you do want more, then maybe it's a Weiss that you want to do, and certain strains lend themselves better to these than others. We have then obviously the flavor and aroma, which is the do all and say all of it all. And the reason why this is spliced out separately to biotransformation is because the flavor and aroma is specific to the yeast fermentative characteristics that it imparts. For instance, banana. It's just an example, but there's many other different types. We have passion fruit and we have apple, guava, all sorts of descriptors that we can use. So this is what we're going to be looking for when we are looking at our different examples, which is what I'm going to go through now. So let's start with the most exciting one right off the bat, the IPA selection that we have at Lallemand Brewing. These are just very convenient for me to put side by side. So we have New England, Bry 97, Verdant, Windsor, and Nottingham, and each one is very good in making their specific types of IPA, which we'll come to just now. But here are just some of the standard parameters that they are able to tolerate, as well as some of the finer details as to even which type of biotransformation that they do. And I will go into detail for this if you would like me to. There is a short little slide that I do have that I'll just touch on the matter. But things to consider, for example, in the differences that you can see is immediately from a flocculation perspective, we see that New England is a medium one, whereas we have a high flocculation with Nottingham and a low one for Windsor. Alcohol tolerance, as I said, it's able to withstand a 12 Plato wort very well, or even higher, but it generally doesn't like to go past 9%. So if you wanted to go past that 9%, you really need to consider using something like Brew 97 or even Nottingham if you want to push it. Let's move on to their flavor wheels. So these are the different types of characteristics you can expect from the different strains. Now, New England just happens to be my personal favorite. It gives a very lovely amount of tropical fruit, which for me perceives as passion fruit or grenadilla, with a nice amount of a little bit of red apple stalking type of aroma on the, that red apple skin. Whereas Brew 97 is a lot more neutral, but a little bit more expressive than Nottingham, which is on the other side of the spectrum. You'll see that Nottingham is just missing the little bit of the tropical fruit aroma there. Windsor is another strain that I've recently come to enjoy. A little bit more subdued than New England on its flavor wheel, but also amazingly pleasant. There were some beers last year at the Intervarsity made with Windsor that I was blown away by. And then, of course, the one that everybody loves is Verdant. It's massively bold in tropical fruit as well as aroma, and apricot is a massive one that comes through on this, so people tend to like this strain a lot. But that's not all you need to take into consideration. You also need to see how well it will ferment given all the standard parameters that you have supplied it with. So if we assume some standard gravities of 12 Plato and the same pitching rate for all the strains under the same temperature of 20 degrees Celsius, these are the types of profiles you will expect to see from the yeast as it ferments. Now, New England is the orange strain over here, which people tend to get nervous by because they see quite a significant lag phase within the first 24 hours. And then they generally tend to panic and add a little bit more yeast, thinking that it's not fermenting. But if they were a little bit more patient, the yeast has already gotten down to a very similar amount what the other strains are doing within 48 hours. And in fact, even attenuates further than the other two popular strains, which is Verdant and Windsor, whereas they rocked off very fast in the beginning and were just aggressive. So this is something that we need to seriously look at for in terms of attenuation, where you have something that is going very fast in the beginning, but doesn't attenuate very far. Windsor, the reason why it doesn't attenuate as far as any of the other strains is it's because it is maltotriose negative, which is one of the sugars that I was speaking about initially. So it tends to leave behind leftover sugar that actually lends itself nicely to the style of English IPA, for example. Verdant, we can get it lower. There's many ways to curb this. You can change your mashing scheme to render out more fermentable sugars, or even render out less fermentable sugars if you would so wish. Whereas, Nottingham and Brew 97 go down really, really nice and low in their attenuations. So the leftover 2 degrees Plato over here is basically the residual dextrins that are resulting from your mash. Whereas in wine and distilling, that's not the problem. It will actually usually ferment down to 0. But in beer, this is very important for style. Oh, sorry, wrong one. So going to biotransformation, there's a lot of text on this slide. Don't worry, I'm not reading word for word. What I want to draw your attention to is the 2 different types of biotransformation that we have. And in short, the model is that what biotransformation is you have these little compounds, this one and this one, that are sitting in your beer from using your hops that you cannot actually smell and detect. But when there's an enzyme in the process that renders it out, you'll have a little piece over here that becomes aromatically perceivable. Same on this side. This little piece here becomes aromatically perceivable. And then this one is just a glucose molecule, which gets fermented out during fermentation. And this is an amino acid, which gets incorporated during fermentation. So this happens because yeast doesn't only just convert sugar to ethanol so that we can select it to produce beer. They actually are operating on a deeper level to speak with us and say, choose me because I smell and taste good when I work with these hops. And this is why they work so nicely with IPA with IPA hops, sorry, because they are packed full of these types of compounds. and you really can bring the most out of your IPAs when you use strains of yeast that do these type of things. So just to bring your attention to the different strains for the 2 different types of enzymes that we have, New England, we can see, has a massive amount of beta-glucosidase, as well as Bry 97. But what is interesting is that although the enzyme activity is high, it doesn't necessarily mean that it makes a lot of it. So New England, we know, makes a lot of it, and it has a high activity, whereas Bry 97, we need to coax it out a little bit more to make it. Verdant has a decent amount of beta lyase, which is rendering out your thiols in your hops. It's just translating to, in my mind, what beta-glucosidase does is it really makes something taste like more of like liquid fruits breakfast punch, but the pulp side of things, whereas the lyase is a little bit more of the skin for me. That's just how my brain perceives it. And to my surprise, when I was comparing and making these slides, I actually realized why I fell in love with Windsor so much, because its profile is very similar to New England. So no surprise there. Clearly, I'm just not a terpene guy. I like my, well, actually, no, wrong. Clearly, I am a terpene guy, and I don't like my thiols as much. But moving on to the actual selection within styles for IPAs, because we have a diverse amount of styles of IPAs. We've made life easy for you guys and tried to make a little chart that you guys can use. But at the same time, you need to engage with people like myself and your clientele to see what they would like out of their beers, and then select the strain that is maybe best appropriate. The perfect example for me is New England. Don't let the name fool you. Obviously, it's inclined to be used in a New England IPA, but under the South African palate, it's actually being used a lot in West Coasts, even though we don't demarcate it here for being used in West Coast IPAs. It all comes down to what you want in your beer, and you need to take into consideration the capabilities that the strain can bring. A little bit of auxiliary strains that we have is the Köln, for example, makes excellent cold IPAs because it also has a very high biotransformative capability, but it likes cold temperatures very well. So you can basically ferment it like a lager and get the most out of your IPA hops. Voss is on the hot side of things. And Philly sour is to do your souring component of your beers prior to either sequentially inoculating with one of these strains, but because it is also a wild strain, it also happens to work very, very well on IPA hops. It just doesn't have a lot of its energy being dedicated to alcoholic fermentation, so it tries to do other things to get our attention, like generating aroma and some acidity. Aromazyme is an enzyme that you can use in conjunction with any of these strains. It's just a little side note. It's an extra process aid that you will add to bring more bank out of your hops, or even to reduce your hop bill and get the same amount of expression. Moving swiftly on to Belgians, for example, the reason why I've brought my Belgian strains over here is because I want to again hammer on the level of attenuation. If we look at Belle Saison, it has a very high level of attenuation because it has a gene in it that allows it to ferment dextrin, which is that leftover complex starch that I was referring to earlier. So Saison beers are generally quite dry and champagne-y, and it's what you want in the beer. It's part of the style. And the yeast will never be able to ferment that leftover dextrin down to 0 Plato if it doesn't have this gene. So this strain is very tricky to work with, or not specifically this strain, but any diastatica strain, that's the name for the yeast that is called when it has this gene. You've got to be careful and not be clean. You've got to be very clean, because if you put it into an IPA next to it, it's going to turn it into a brute IPA by accident. So generally speaking, you've got to have dedicated systems when working with diastaticus, or have very good CIP protocols in place where you clean with caustic and you clean with acid. But we've addressed this problem with something called the farmhouse. And what we've basically done is breed the Belle and the Abbey together to generate something that gives the same characteristics of the Saison, but it doesn't have the risk of that gene. So now it isn't able to ferment the dextrin like it can with the Belle Saison. And you'll still be able to generate a Saison style beer, but now what you have to do is take into account your mashing regime to render out more fermentable sugars and less dextrin, or you can use the AMG enzyme, which just really stands for amyloglucosidase, which is basically the enzyme that this thing generates out of its gene. So you can have it as a thing that you add to your mash by itself so that it won't go and contaminate the rest of your beers. But it's not only meant for a saison, it can be used in many other styles. The Abbey, for instance, we also use in saisons. It's just a bit more fruity than spicy and phenolic. These two strains tend to be spicy, whereas this one is a bit more fruity, a lot more banana. All three of these have very good high alcohol tolerances. Obviously, this one can ferment more sugar, which is why it tends to withstand higher alcohol tolerances. And the temperature is something to consider. So if you ferment a bit on the warmer side for Belle Saison, you tend to get a bit more spice and phenolics, whereas if you have it a bit cooler, it's more on the fruity side because you can actually trap those aromas. But yeah, so it's very interesting to have these strains side by side in Belgian beers because they can be used in most of them. These are the flavor wheels, and here you can very nicely see, for instance, the breeding between the two. They didn't use Belle and Abbey themselves to breed, but it's very interesting to see that the peppery component coming from a strain like the Belle is incorporated in the farmhouse, as well as the tropical fruit from the Abbey is going in there with a slight amount of muted banana that it's maybe more inheriting from this type of thing. So really, these are very versatile strains, and it just comes down to the finer details of, do you want the diastaticus? Do you want this type of flavor profile? Or do you want that type of flavor profile? And again, we've made it easy for you. We have all the different Belgian styles that we have over here, and you can pretty much see that Farmhouse and Abbey ticks every single box. All the circle means is that this is what traditionally a Saison strain would be used in, which is what the Belle would go in. That was great. Yeah. So I just had to sneak that little one in there because the Nova Lager has been an up-and-coming strain that we have bred to address specific problems in lager brewing. And I know my marketing team spent a lot of time and effort on that video, so I thought I would do them a little bit of a favor and actually show that to you guys. But let's talk about lager. So we have 3 different options from my portfolio to use, for example. We have 2 proper Pastorianus strains, and a pseudo lager Cerevisiae strain. So don't get too caught up on whether a lager strain is actually Pastorianus or not. The only reason why Pastorianus was used in lagers is because it happens to survive cooler temperatures very well, and as a result of being in a colder fermentation, it tends to sit at the bottom of the tank, and that's a lot of hydrostatic pressure in large tanks. So it's purely by accident. You do get certain Cerevisiae strains that can handle that too quite well. This is just a bit of genetics to show that this is indeed 100% Cerevisiae, whereas this is 50-50 between the 2 parental strains. And this one's more of a 75-25 split that we hybridized ourselves in a very similar way to what we did with the farmhouse. The attenuation ranges are quite similar. The flocculations are high for these 2. And we can get high flocculations for the Nova Lager, but we decided to put down medium because we have found that depending on the recipe of the malt bills used, especially if people tend to use a lot of adjunct beers, that it tends to stay in suspension. But if you cool it properly and you add maybe a processing aid, it flocks down to the bottom, no problems. Temperature ranges is the major component that makes Nova Lager different. So usually you would ferment between 10 to 15 degrees Celsius with a diamond, for example, with a very high pitch rate, because you need more biomass available to even facilitate fermentation at those type of temperatures, because the yeast cannot grow. So you have to supplement that amount of yeast in. Whereas the Nottingham can also survive between 10 and 15, but even as high as 25 because it's an ale strain. But the caveat is, with the lower temperature of things, you still need to add the higher side of the pitch rate. That 50 grams is as a result of it being an IPA strain in higher temperatures above 16 degrees Celsius. The Nova has a very nice bandwidth between 10 and 20 degrees Celsius, and I can confidently say that at 12, somewhere around 12 degrees Celsius, 50 grams per 100 liters, all you need. It ferments out in 3 to 4 days, and the major benefit of the Nova is that, you know, it has no sulfur being produced. There's no H2S. That's the main thing that we bred into the strain, and very, very little diacetyl is produced, which is that butter flavor that you get from beers that haven't gone through a proper diacetyl rest. It does have a bit of an estery component, probably due to the fact that it's able to grow very well under any condition. And a lot of people actually like it. The Americans have been playing with this strain a lot, and they really like the pear that comes out of it. Whereas Nottingham, as we all know, it's very, very neutral, and Diamond is also incredibly neutral. But these two strains will tend to produce a little bit of sulfur. It's just due to the high stress conditions of a cold ferment. So H2S production, I just wanted to show you what happens. So this is a typical lager strain. Anton on the panel over here is probably understanding what's going on here, because it's a typical lager strain. So, and Diamond is also a typical lager strain, and you can see that we have a nice production of H2S here, which is actually not something you want. It's a rotten egg smell, and it makes quite a lot of it in concentration. Over here, we see very little being produced by Nottingham and almost nothing by Nova, that we had to zoom in here into the really low ranges of the ppm here. And you can see that, okay, cool, Nottingham still produces it. And you need really, really, really low thresholds of H2S to even detect it. So it's a massive benefit that Nova Lager doesn't produce it at all. The other main benefit of using Nova Lager, for example, is diacetyl production. This is something you do need to take into consider when you are fermenting lagers. It's part of its valine metabolism in how it's cleaning up the beer in the later stages of fermentation. And generally what a brewer will do is raise the temperature at the later stages of fermentation to help the yeast reabsorb all that diacetyl. And you can just see that when it's busy producing the diacetyl over here during fermentation stages, that it's easier when you have less amounts being produced. So all this means is that Diamond and typical lager strains need a little bit more processing time because of the diacetyl rest, which is a standard thing to do in lagers. It's a normal thing. Whereas the Nova, you can skip that because it's not producing a lot of it and absorbs it quite quickly. But yeah, well, there's a lot of things we covered. We can make your lives easy, and you guys use my Lallemand Brewing app, available on iOS and the Google Play Store. But also don't be afraid to talk to someone like me and reach out. At the end of the day, the app is going to be giving you the standard parameters of what I've pretty much covered today, whereas I'm able to help you dive into your end goal and really select the best strain. Let's go into yeast nutrition. So a few of the standard things that are encompassed in yeast nutrition are, for example, your nitrogen, sterols, trace factors, and oxygen. We won't be covering sterols and oxygen today. Main problems that I've seen in industry are usually a lack of nitrogen, especially with high adjunct beers, now more than ever, because the price of malt has increased so substantially that people are looking for alternative sources of sugar, which tend to lack in nitrogen. So sources of nitrogen that you can add into your fermentations are diammonium phosphate, which is DAP, organic amino acids, which will be coming naturally from your malt, and the concentration is very important for the amount of sugar that's in your fermentation. Trace factors are such like vitamins, which is vitamin B, very, very good for yeast, as well as magnesium and zinc. And all this is facilitating the enzymatic processes of glycolysis, which I can go into detail if you want, but all it's doing is, if you imagine an enzyme during fermentation, it's a little worker that is helping to convert your sugar to ethanol. And if that worker isn't greased and the screws aren't tightly turned and the nuts aren't secured properly, that's going to slow down your process. And that's basically what your magnesiums and your zincs do in these enzymes. They bend it into the correct conformation so that the process can go smoothly. These are all the things that we're going to be ticking off when you are looking at your wort. Does it have enough nitrogen? Does it have the trace factors? Did you pump enough oxygen and sterols so that the little bugger that you selected in your agar plate can actually work nicely for you? So wort fan is basically the meat of your fermentation. It's all the amino acids, your proteins that your yeast is going to uptake and convert into the building blocks for your enzymes so that glycolysis can actually go through smoothly and the yeast can grow. A nice thing about amino acids in general, which is why I prefer to use amino acids as a supplement rather than DAP, is because we have something called the Ehrlich pathway, in which the branch chain amino acids basically go through a short little biochemical process, which I won't go into detail for now, but you're going to end up with more fusel alcohols, which is like your propanols, your butanols, you know, anything more than 2 carbons in an alcohol, which is ethanol. They lend themselves very well to flavor and aroma. They're in very low amounts, but they really help with like roundness of your beverage that you're drinking. The fusel acids are just a little bit of crispness in going in, but it's not the same type of acidity that you get from a proper sour beer. And aldehydes also have their own contribution to flavor. So this is bouncing between the three all the time. But when you have an amino acid that is branched, it will go through this process and help your yeast generate a little bit more flavor, which is why I like to use complex amino acids as a nutritional supplement rather than straightforward DAP. So more FAN in your fermentations, which stands for free amino nitrogen or free assimilable nitrogen, because it can be DAP, will generally translate to faster fermentation. So these are just 2 little graphs that I have side by side to show if we have a sugar fermentation that has no natural nitrogen occurring, what the effect of more nitrogen will do in the setup. So we have Yeast Life O here, which is an organic matrix. It's just amino acids. We have a dosage rate of 100 grams per 100 liters, so 1 gram per liter, versus 250 grams. And we can see that obviously the 2 different lines are just the 2 different dosage rates of the yeast. So obviously the more yeast you have, the faster it will be. But you can definitely see that when you have less nitrogen in a system, that it ferments over a longer period of time, a more elongated curve than when you have enough nitrogen in your system. And these amounts just happen to coincide with what we see in literature of what is kind of the minimum requirement needed for fermentation between 12 and 28 Plato. And this is true for wine, this is true for beer, this is true for any distilling setup. This is the rough rule of thumb that you need to apply on a sliding scale of how much sugar is in your fermentation. So we move on to the other effect that FAN has, which is coming back to H2S, which is something that also the Nova Lager addresses. If you're experiencing H2S in your yeasts, in an ale, especially because you shouldn't have that much of a tricky system for the yeast to not cope with, it means you 10 to 1 don't have enough food in your matrix. It's a stress signal for the yeast and it will throw H2S. If you do have enough nitrogen, it's able to reabsorb the H2S. It can be, you can induce it to give more H2S if you want by starving. A little bit of sulfur is sometimes a good thing in your beers. It can lend itself well, but in general, if sulfur is there, it masks the effects of what your hops are bringing to the table. There is a Lallemand Brewing crowdcast and white paper. If you guys want to have a bit more detail on H2S, I'm more than happy to share that information with you guys. Don't worry, we're not going into the hectic biochemistry over here. It's just for visual reference. But if you want me to explain it, I will. The reason why a yeast even considers to produce H2S is because it's actually a way for it to combat the growing acidic environment of beer or any fermentation as it's occurring. Protons are free in the system when a yeast is busy fermenting, which leads to the acidic environment. And all the sulfur does is it binds those free protons to reduce the acidity immediately around the cell. It's a survival tactic. And it will try and do that when there's not enough nitrogen in the system and not enough vitamins. So you encourage it to reabsorb the H2S over here when you have enough nitrogen for it to attach that sulfur compound back onto the backbone of an amino acid, which we'll cover if you want me to. Let's go into the minerals of things. They're very important in trace amounts for things such as your cell division and growth, your cell-to-cell interactions, which is your flocculation, your overall structure, stress tolerance of the yeast, the fermentation efficacy, and enzyme activity. So the ones that I've already mentioned are magnesium and zinc, and they're specifically important for the glycolytic pathway. This is a very dumbed down version, and all I want you to take away from this image is that magnesium is responsible for 80% of the pathway, from here to here. And the reason why I have these compounds over here is that the cell obtains its energy for growth and fermentation through the 80% of this pathway. What happens here is that acetaldehyde can be something that accumulates and throws off your green apple aroma, which is something you do not want in beer. It's considered as a off flavor. It means your fermentation wasn't healthy. This enzyme that converts acetaldehyde to ethanol is zinc. And this is what is deficient in your fermentations, especially nowadays with malts. We have found that malts have generally had a decline of zinc concentration. And this is something that we need to consider supplementing into our beers, especially to avoid the green apple. So in summary, the calcium is something very important for flocculation that I didn't cover. All you need to know is that when you add enough calcium into your brewing water, it's not only for the benefit of the hops to bring out your hop aroma, but it's also to help your yeast to flocculate down. But in general, the magnesium and zinc are important for fermentation, good for stress resistance, and as I said, the calcium is good for your flocculation performance. And zinc is taken up very, very quickly in a fermentation. So if you're planning to repitch your yeast, you need to know that the zinc is immobile, and you cannot take a diluted population into a next brew without suffering some sort of zinc deficiency. It is crucial to make sure you add enough zinc to your fermentations, especially if you are repitching. So here's just a few quick little examples that I'm going to fly over of the different products that we have at Lallemand. We have Yeast Life O, which I already introduced to you as that organic complex nutrient, just the organic nutrient of amino acids. We have Yeast Life Extra, which is a complex nutrient of both diammonium phosphate, some amino acids, sterols, vitamins, a little bit of zinc sulfate. It really ticks all the boxes. It's my go-to when I am introducing people to fermentation and we just want to have all of our bases covered. Saccharomyces is a specific product for zinc supplementation. It is a yeast that we have grown up specifically to have high levels of zinc in its system, so that when you add it into the boil and the cells burst, it releases the zinc into the system. It's really, really good to use. Just to show you the effects between the different nutritional products, the control has had no nutrition added. The blue line is the Yeast Life Extra, and the brown-green line is the Saccharomyces. And the main thing I want to draw your attention here to is the repitching side of things. So you can see in general, it's a little bit better of a fermentation with the Yeast Life Extra and the Saccharomyces. But over here, when we have generation 8 after repitching, we see that the control starts to slag off a little bit. And that's where the extra zinc supplementation comes in. So the Saccharomyces is definitely first prize for this type of application, but at least you can get a little bit of a better fermentation with the Yeast Life Extra and have all your other bases covered. That's all I wanted you to take away from this slide. And here it's showing the effect of basically a high adjunct wort where malt is too expensive and you decided to throw some corn, or you bring a Belgian beer and you have some candied sugars that is supposed to be in your fermentation. It is very a good idea to have nutrition in your system, because here we can see that just the effect of having 40% high maltose corn syrup and 60% malt, there's a massive difference in the fermentation times area. So again, this is saying that the more fan you have and nitrogen you have, the better and faster your fermentations will be. And this is again just showing what happens at generation 8. It's a little bit more wonky, but as we apply Saccharomyces, it's definitely the first prize for zinc. Where it's Yeast Life Extra, it ticks all the boxes as what you need. Just a few little quick facts of the different products, which I've pretty much already covered. Just to hammer home, Yeast Life Extra is a general ticks all the boxes, whereas Yeast Life O is specifically to address nitrogen. if you're doing apple cider fermentations or want to do a hard seltzer, or you just want to be organic, that's the one to use. Saccharomyces is literally to fix a problem with repitching and propagation of your yeast with high gravity brews. Very, very low dose rates, 1 to 2 grams per 100 liters. Yeast Life Extra is 4 to 15, depending on the starting Plato, but I generally find brewers get away with between 4 to 6. And the reason why this dose rate is high is because the application that we market it for is for hard seltzers. If you are in a brewing setup where your nitrogen is coming from your wort, you can look to significantly decrease this. Probably about the same as what you have with Yeast Life Extra. I have played with it a bit in the industry. The reason why you never want to exceed this dosage rate, and you never want to exceed 15 grams to actually more closer to 25 to 30 grams for these two, is because of zinc. If you throw too much zinc in, you can poison the yeast. So you only need a very little amount just to carry your yeast home. So just remember that, you've chosen your excellent yeast. You want to give it the best fermentation possible. So you need to make sure that it has the best food available for itself. So the composition of your wort is key, and you should end up with an excellent beer. And that's my presentation. I tried to keep it short for you guys. Hopefully I did well. If you guys need anything, you can always just reach out to me. My email address is here. I'm sure my cell phone number is lying around with one of the other students that are a bit older in any of your teams. Please reach out to me at any point, and I'm more than happy to go through the selection process with you of deciding which yeast you want to use and how to get the best out of your fermentations. That's all from me today.
Thank you so much, Jacques. I just want to say, I think this is the most amazing competition to be part of, because with all the information that was shared this week on the different webinars and everybody just saying, giving out their email addresses and telling you guys that you are welcome to make contact with them, I just think it's absolutely awesome for anybody that's taking part in this competition. Jacques, it seems like your slides addressed all the possible questions that the delegates may have had. But I've got one question for you. And the question that I've got is, what is the difference between medium and moderate flocculation?
That's a good question. I suppose it will come down to if we had to rate it in terms of percent. Medium, I think, is a little bit better than moderate, the way that my marketing team likes to talk about it. And the other reason why I make mention of that is because I know that Nova Lager can be a very good flocculator. But I think there's also just a bit of drift that has occurred during my best practices documents that are made. So some of them are older than others. So I think the term can be used interchangeably. Just bear in mind that if you talk to me about every strain, I can tell you the caveats between the different ones. So, for example, how Nova Lager can be a medium or moderate flocculating strain, but if you do certain things, you can get a high flocculating strain too.
Anton, I see you've got something to add.
Yes, if I can. Hi, Jacques, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Anton.
Hi, but thanks for this. It's really nice. You mentioned on Nova Lager that it comes from 2 parent strains that are GMO free. Did I get that correctly?
Yes, they are.
Yeah, again, carry on.
No, sorry, Anton.
Yeah. So how big a deal is that, and in what jurisdictions would it be a no-go if there was GMO in the parentage, or are there any legal situations anywhere in any jurisdictions in the world where it's frowned upon to have a GMO yeast, etc.?
I'm glad you asked the question, Anton, because this is something that has been in conversation actually since we released the Philly Sour. A lot of people thought that we had GMO'd the strain, but it was actually just a natural isolate. To answer your question, it is a very big no-no in the European market. It's very similar to the wine realm. They do not want GMO in their processes, but it is loved in the States. So we have GMO strains. We have a GMO Sour Vitier that is a Cerevisier where we had the gene cloned into it to produce lactic acid as it ferments. So we have that strain. We are GMOing a low alcohol strain, and we are also, I think what we're trying to do is replicate everything we've done in breeding with the GMO side of things too, from either an academic perspective as well as a commercial side of things.
Okay, good.
But the Nova Lager is definitely GMO free. It has been produced through a hybridization process, which is just a fancy word for breeding.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks for that, Jacques and Anton. I think I'm going to, there's questions that was on the survey. So Troy, I'm going to address these questions to you, and if there's any of the other panelists that would also like to answer, you know, please feel free. So Troy, my first question to you is, what is the contribution, importance of pH and water mineral content in brewing? That's the first part. And then what stages in the brewing is most influenced by pH and water mineral content, and how?
Thank you very much for that question. Hopefully you can hear me. I appreciate the question, but I also think, you know, someone like Jacques can definitely pitch in here, excuse the pun, in terms of this pH subject. Yeah, there's a lot of different material that suggests the correct pH for your finished beer, but I think Jacques was pretty accurate there with, I think he said between 4 and 5 pH. But I think Jacques did carry on or provide a lot of detail in terms of the minerality of the ions of what you need. Just to summarize, there are the 6 main ions that you need to focus on. But from I know I've got a lot of experience with homebrewing, and I will say it's almost like a cheat sheet to the students. It feels like you're cheating when you dive into the world of the mineral content of water in brewing, because it's just an amazing way to get the right base for your beer and to just start ticking all the boxes so that your beer can thrive in the fermentation process. So to jump back in terms of the pH, I think the most important process, well, not that all the processes or parts aren't important, but it's definitely pre-mash. You want to make sure that before you do anything, you want to check the source of your water and what the contents are, and adjust it beforehand, so that you can get the best out of your brew. Yeah, Jacques, do you want to add on anything to that?
Sure, Troy, you pretty much covered most of it, especially from the mashing perspective. It's very difficult for me to, or easy for me to forget about other parts of it that aren't yeast related, but your pH is key to even render out your sugars and your nutrients while you're doing your brewing process. The only thing that I would add is that pH does not necessarily translate to perceived acidity. So if we take, for example, Philly sour or a lactobacillus while you're doing a souring IPA or something, the amount of lactic acid that gets produced is generally correlated with the amount of pH drop, but you can have something that is at pH 3.4 or 3.6, and the 3.6 tastes more sour than the 3.4, because you need to remember that pH is only a measure of the free protons in your system, whereas what you are tasting is the double carboxylate group of the actual acid, the organic acid that binds onto your taste buds. So when you're doing your sour with Philly, for example, you can render it to be perceived more sour if you give it less complex sugar, less complex sugars, so mainly dextrose or sucrose or something like that, and your pH drop might not necessarily reflect the increase in perceived acidity. That's all I have to add.
Fantastic. Okay, and then another one in terms of the process, carbonation. Can I use sugar instead of CO2? Troy, that one's also for you or any of the other panelists?
Yeah, I'll have a first crack at it. As someone who's been homebrewing for over 10 years, I swear by table sugar. It's something that I have used, and I swear by it. It's given me great results. I feel that you can really, especially if you have a bit of time and you're not rushing your beer, you can get a more subtle bubble or carbonation, obviously depending on what style of beer you want. But I still use sugar in bottling my beer. I do it individually. That means I will get my clean bottles. I will have the correct measurements. I will put I usually do brown sugar, and I will put that in each bottle. I then top up each bottle with my fermented beer after the secondary fermentation, and sorry, after the primary fermentation, and then cap it, and then yeah, that secondary fermentation will happen in the bottle over a period of 2 weeks. But there's nothing wrong in letting it go for 3 weeks. Anyone else want to add on to that?
Okay, it seems like you answered it and everybody is comfortable, so that's fantastic. Now on to some other questions, and Anton, the first question is for you. What is the most commonly used brewing system?
Can you guys hear me now? Am I on?
Yeah.
Yes, Anton?
Okay, so it's probably important to know from whence this question comes. I mean, clearly it's not a question about what does SAB or Heineken and what does Carlsberg use. I mean, the large systems are pretty well understood. But what you're basically asking is it a student group saying, what do I need to produce the next beer on a small scale? Is that the question?
Yes, it came out of the survey. Yeah. So,
okay, so the most common off-the-shelf kind of stuff, I think, is mostly these grainfather type equipment. I see the Indian and Chinese are all making versions of the concept, typically between, say, about 30 and 50 liters. I see some examples just the hot side equipment going for about 18 to 20,000 rand for a full hot side kit. That does limit you, but it's almost a foolproof piece of equipment. It's great for learning on, but I know some serious brewers who muck about at the house with something like that. But we've had people that are from our side that were using literally buckets and spades, kind of, like a muslin cloth for hopping and all kinds of that kind of stuff, the plastic fermenters, and we had people with pots and pans on the hot side making very, very decent beer. But the first commercial step up, where you can buy a piece of kit that's literally off the shelf of the grainfather types. But looking at the equipment that the students made and the varsities made after SAB donated some money, I think this understanding of how to brew and forcing the students to think out the box and construct the fermenters and the reactors out of what they knew was required and the old kegs and stuff we gave them. Some of the equipment that the students have made, way cheaper, I would say, than a grainfather system, is capable of making beer at least as good, if not better. And we've proven that with some of the results we've had.
Definitely.
The grainfather is like Hoover. It's a name of a specific brand, but it's a kind of a systemic name now. If you say a grainfather, they understand it's one of these kind of recirculation kind of hot side kits that you can get off the counter.
Yes, and I can also remember from last year the presentation from the student side showing all their interesting ways that they've put, their systems together. So thank you for that answer. And I think something that relates to that was another question that we had, and quite an interesting question. And it is, at what scale does brewing begin to be profitable?
Okay, so I can only assume that somebody that's thinking of scaling up one day and saying, I love brewing and I want to become a brewer and I want to make money. If you see how the garage yeast and the microbrewing side of things work, 99% of the operations are people that I can do 3 brews a day, 6 days, maybe 5 days a week. But while there's a 1 or 2 hour lag in the process, I can quickly sit down and do some accounting for somebody else and make some other money on the side. There's a difference between commercial application and profitability. If you just take the gross margin of what you can do with, say, a 5 or 10 hectoliter piece of kit, some people will be able to run a small family if that was their only job and they committed themselves. But understand, you can't do a 4x8 or a 3x8 shift system and get all the activity and all the utilization that you can think of out of the hot side. And when you do that, you need to understand that if you've got an 8-hour fermenter, or just say a 12-hour fermenter, hot side, you're going to need to have, and you've got, say, 3 weeks of fermentation, you're going to need literally 60 times more ferment capacity, cold side capacity, than you have of your hot side. So as soon as you start trying to convert it into money, you need to understand, where are you measuring? Are you trying to make money out of it? Are you trying to cut your losses so that your hobby doesn't become too expensive? And what's the point of copying Castle Lager if Castle Lager is very cost effective over the counter? You need to make something that is very, very interesting. But the more interesting you make it, the lower the volume is that you're going to start selling it. So I would suggest the question probably is, how do I cut my costs? And how do I make it more enjoyable that this hobby doesn't end up costing me too much? To go full commercial, you need to understand the difference between gross and net margin. You need to understand heat recovery. You need to understand energy saving devices. You need to understand how much time you've got, whether you're going to start employing labor. But there are small businesses that have run certain brands, small brands, on 10 hectoliter and 5 hectoliter brewing kits. In fact, Kasper Schultz and one or two of the Czechoslovakian crowd actually make, and I think Hoekman also used to make kits in the 3, 5, and 10 hectoliter. But those typically were for brew pubs, where you would make enough beer not to have to buy from the big guys, but the rest of the overheads were covered by the restaurant or by other parts of the business. It's very, very difficult. That's why you see the successful guys today tend to be large scale, and they spend their spare money on marketing to keep the brands alive. The small guy literally wants to make a beer that's different, wants to be differentiated from the big guys and make something that he likes. But you're going to end up making that on small scale, because how are you going to market and bottle, and there's a lot of costs over and above just the hot side and the cold side. So you need to actually tease that apart. In fact, you'll probably find an MBA guy would do probably a 6-month like a course or a 6-month thesis on this to work out what those cutoff points would be as to when it becomes profitable and when it becomes commercial. It's a very tricky question.
Oh, well, I must say, I appreciate the way that you answer it. It gave a lot of food for thought in terms of actually what it is that you want to do. So thank you very much for that. Troy, I've got another question for you, please. And it is, what and how does the process work to develop and register a new beer style?
Thank you very much for that question. And I'm assuming it was for the BJCP, which is the Beer Judge Certificate Program, which is what all beers in this competition are being judged to. So there are actually plans afoot, whether people know it or not, that we'd really like to get an African style registered. We'd really like the South African style to be incorporated into the BJCP style guidelines. But it is a process. I think we are right now in the exploratory phase of what we can call a South African beer. I think we've got quite a diverse range of different plant species and hops and different grains that we can look at. But we're still in the early phases in terms of trying to explore what can be called an African or South African beer. So in terms of what's really existing in the BJCP at the moment, there are a few styles, namely Catarina style from Brazil. We've got an Italian grape style. We've got a New Zealand Pilsner. So these beer styles are ones that have been recently added, but it's taken some time to get there. So I think to answer that question, or my plea to the students who are making beers, follow the guidelines, but see what South African influence you can incorporate where it allows And I think what we saw last year from the competition was a great start to that development of finding a South African style beer. I think it was the wild category from last year. I stand to be corrected what category it was, but yeah, very excited to see what the students come up with.
Absolutely. We've run a little bit over time, so I'm going to now stop the questions, but I just want to say to the students that signed in that as you know that we've placed the previous webinars on the Intervarsity brew.co.za website, and you are more than welcome to go and watch them again. There's the contact details as well available of all the presenters, so please go and have a look. I know that there was a question specifically on how the labels will be scored and all of that. Maraldi had an excellent presentation. There's also a PDF that's a download of the presentation, once again pointing to where the marks will be going to, so please go and have a look at that. And I just also want to say that we will be communicating with all of you via the MailChimp and the mail shots that we've sent. We will make sure that you are constantly informed of important dates and you know, when you're supposed to send in what. So please make sure that you look out for these mail shots, and if you currently are not aware or if you haven't received any of them, please just inform Olga, and you can email Olga on odesmith, smit@cut.ac.za. I'm just going to repeat that. So it's Olga, so it's odesmit@cut.ac.za. So please just then inform her, and that we can make sure that you are part of the mailing list. Once again, please answer the survey after the broadcast stop, and we are looking forward to see to it what interesting beers you are going to submit for this competition. And I just want to wish you all of the best and happy brewing. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.